Hello, and welcome to another episode of Architecture for Kids podcast. I'm your host, António Capelão. I'm a trained architect, an architectural educator, and founding director of award-winning Architecture for Kids CIC. In this podcast, I'm going to talk to practitioners and creatives that share the same passion as I do, to inspire and to engage children and young people to shape their built environment and the creative industries. The podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the Built Environment Trust, the Thornton Education Trust, and the Welsh School of Architecture, Cardiff University. My guest today is Simeon Shtebunaev. Simeon is an interdisciplinary researcher in the built environment. His PhD project at Birmingham City University explores how young people engage in the planning of future smart cities. He was the principal investigator on the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project Are You Game for Climate Action, developing the board game Climania with young people focusing on the role of the built environment in climate change. Simeon was selected as the RIBA Journal Rising Star 2021 and the Royal Town Planning Institute's Young Planner of the Year 2022. He chairs the Cultural Infrastructure and Investment Working Group, part of the West Midlands Combined Authority Cultural Leadership Board. Simeon, thank you for coming to talk to me today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for having me.
What was your favorite subject at school, and what were you good at?
I was one of those annoying people that was good at everything at school, which was really bad. But I enjoyed mathematics. That was my favorite subject at school. I had further maths. I did mathematics competitions. I did international competitions in mathematics. I loved maths. But I think then led into all the other subjects, because I think once you get the logic of how to think in a structured manner, you can crack all the other subjects as well, because all the social sciences, everything else, it has the same structure. I enjoyed pretty much everything, but maths was my favorite.
Did it help you in your career and what you're doing today?
I've noticed a lot of social scientists come from a very arts-led background, or a background which is centered in the humanities. I think with having a maths background, it really helps me to look at the bigger picture and think strategically and think about in the equation what's actually missing, what are the different bits that are not there, and that's where I'm focusing my research on, and hence the work with young people and teenagers.
You are doing a lot of work with young people and a varied work. Shall we start with the planning work, because I find that interesting in terms of the podcast?
Yeah, for sure. At the moment, apart from working as a researcher at Social Life in London, I'm also a lecturer and PhD researcher at Birmingham City University. My research really focuses on how, when we develop future city visions, and I'm really interested in the smart city visions, how do we involve all of society and in particular young people? I'm really interested in what are the processes in the planning, visioning, when we actually set out what we want the future to be. Where are the voices of young people integrated, but in a structural manner? So, where the policies, where the processes, where the best practice case studies. So when you are a planner, or when you lead an economic directorate in a council, or when you're a developer, you know how to actually integrate that voice, and it's already there, it's already a practice. I think that already is happening a lot more, but it's still case by case basis. And I think for me, that's an interesting challenge to think about, okay, how do we do that in a structured, in a standardized manner, so people actually, that becomes just normal part of the work. And on the other side, in my own PhD, I'm really been interested in the views of the young people. So actually understanding what it is that you want from a city, and what are the priorities, and are we actually planning our cities around those priorities of that demographic. And maybe I can talk a bit more about that in a bit, but
it would be interesting to talk about the landscape of planning and young people. What is being done? Are you involving kids in planning or not? And will we be involving? If you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is very pertinent, because I'm writing a paper on that, tracking the development of youth inclusion in urban planning. And a lot of the literature comes from America, from the US. If you know the Einstein ladder of participation, in the 80s, there was an academic who works in the international development world. And actually, a lot of the literature about youth inclusion comes from social work and from international development. So if you think about the UNICEF, the UNESCO activities. So there was an academic called Roger Hart who adapted that ladder of participation and created a youth ladder of participation when was talking about the co-production of places in the development world, but then that made its way into the planning world as well. The theory's been there 40 years. In practice, however, the barriers have always been funding, adult-centrism, patronization of young people, and just not being seen as a priority.
You mentioned co-production. Do you want to clarify what co-production means in this setting?
Yeah, so original kind of participation information theories always lead to citizen power. At the end, there is a relinquishing of power from the authority to the citizens. In the youth inclusion field, at the moment, the ceiling has been seen as co-production purely because you're working with people who, by default, in the way that we've structured our societies, would never be able to absorb all the power that you give them because they can't. They don't have the financial means, they don't have the expertise, the experience, and so on. Co-production in this sense means that you facilitate a process in which there is an equal power relationship, but there is still the acknowledgement that ultimately it is adults that would have to produce the environment, but is facilitated. The children and the young people are very much on the table in the same level of decision-making powers. But I think it's important to think that even if we talk about, hearing young people, where they're still in a power relationship with adults, purely because they don't have the economic power, they don't have the voting rights. It would be foolish to say that it's an equal relationship. Always, they have to recognize that there is a power dynamic and then address it.
They also don't have the expertise nor the experience. We need to make that very clear, so that although it is important to have their voices heard, there's an element of expertise and experience that they don't have that needs to be factored in.
You mentioned one of the projects, Climania, that we worked on. In that project, the way we designed our co-production process was we would take all the leads from the young people that we work with. We worked with 12 young people who were our co-leads, co-researchers. We trained them, but we were very aware that at any point when they have to start looking at knowledge base, then they have to start looking at design, skills that they don't have, we as experts could come in and provide those skills. But when we talked about strategy and direction of the project and how do we actually develop the final product, this was very much down to the young people who were leading the project. I think it's important sometimes as an adult in the room or as somebody who's an expert to realize when you have to be a facilitator, when you have to actually be a producer, and when you actually have to just step back and just not be in the room for the decision making without it. Many has to happen because you're producing something that is for that demographic, so you should be decided by that demographic. By the same time, if you just let young people think that they don't have experience and they're not supported, then you're setting them up to fail. So you really need to provide a support network as well. And I think same in planning. It's easy to just say, what do you want in the city without actually giving that background? I mean, quite often I find the issue is people actually don't know about town planning. We don't know how the city is structured and how decisions are taken. When you give them a choice, it's a false choice because they're not informed. So you have to provide that structure around them first. And they'll surprise you because you're even better than you imagined. Yeah.
In terms of what's being done in planning to incorporate the voice of young people, you mentioned a lot of our references and our study comes from the US. But what is actually being done in the UK and what is it that you are doing as well?
The first point of reference would be the RTPI's document that was published about child-friendly planning recently by Jenny Wood and RTPI researchers. The Road Outline Institute, they published policy guides for planners, and one was on child-friendly planning, and that mapped what are the different interplays between the system in the UK. Each planning system in England, Wales, and so on is different. That was interesting, and the answer is not that much is being done. In Scotland, with the new planning system, there is actually some reference to youth inclusion, and there are some tools which have been developed and being integrated. Scotland and Wales are generally further ahead. In Wales, you have the Future Generations Act, which kind of requires all public sector to consider future generations in every decision. So that, by extension, means that youth inclusion is making its way on a legal basis, being integrated. But in terms of actually practice-wise, I'm going to be interviewing a lot of people who are doing the things that on the ground. I can see a lot of developers at the moment, especially with the ESG and social value becoming very much a requirement in every procurement process. Youth inclusion is high on the agenda at the moment. The question is, are you doing youth inclusion to tick off points and get all the briefing, 20% of social value on that you get the commission? Are you supporting those young people after that? And then actually, if you're really doing it well, is that learning being captured? And I think this is the bit where we're missing something at the moment to coordinate all of these good initiatives and get all those lessons together.
Why is it so important to involve kids and young people in the planning process?
I will give you my journey to this, and other people might agree or disagree. For me, it's a great test. It's a stress test. Are you producing spaces and places that cater for everybody? And when you think about everybody, we could equally pick another disadvantaged group and stress test that. For me, youth and children are such a major part of society. 25% of the UK is under 18 or something like that. We just completely ignore them. And I think quite often people would say, oh, because they're the future, is they our future? And I think that's a bit of a bogus argument sometimes, because they're not our future. They're here. They exist. Actually, are you catering for people at that point in life? And are you actually trying to understand what their needs are right now, not just what their needs might be in the future? And I think in my research specifically, a lot of the time, so I evaluated a lot of smart city strategies across Europe. A lot of the times, young people are seen as a future economic resource, not as a future users or future decision makers, or even as current users and current decision makers. And I think that's a big issue. So I think it's really important to involve them in the production space because they are using space at the moment. So actually understanding what their needs right now are is really, really important. And I think also, young people do shape the built environment right now. So there is a fantastic book called States of Childhood, which focuses on these kind of youth-led cities in the US in the 1800s, which were completely led by youth. The police, the court system, everything was young people. And they worked. They were like a weird experiment, when America's the land of the free and everybody could do whatever they wanted. But equally, when I was a teenager, when I was a kid, in my neighborhood in Bulgaria, we would just go and build random bits around the neighborhood. So we would actually be actively shaping the built environment, if you count sheds as a built environment. And I think that freedom of taking ownership of where you live is not just lost, but it's actively being eroded, especially when it comes to young people. You're actually prohibiting them from shaping the built environment. And I think all young people, have that drive to do so. They want to create their own dens, they want to create their own little spaces. And why wouldn't they be able to do so if you actually create those opportunities?
And why are we prohibiting them to do so?
For me, the simple answer is they don't generate economic value in the current system in the way that we're actually thinking about economic value at the moment. I work with teenagers a lot. At that age, you could argue they actually work, they actually do use a lot of services, they do actually spend a lot of money, given, their parents' money, but maybe they earn their own money as well. But in the systems that we kind of have at the moment, children and young people are just that intermediate state before they become generators of economic value. Therefore, they're not seen as users, they're not seen as people who should be satisfied, they're seen as people who should be trained and who should be socialized, then become the productive part of society. And I think until we shift that perception and understand that no, social and cultural production is also equally valuable production of value, then we can actually start valuing what the young people are doing. Because a lot of culture actually that we have comes from youth culture. A lot of ways of how people decide where to live is because of their children and the needs of their children, but we don't really conceptualize that. Think about the economic side. That's one thing. The other thing is also in the current structure that we have, they don't have a voting power. They don't have opportunity to express those views. They're not being given the structures in which they can actually feed into that. So then obviously if you're not hearing what the needs are, then you're not going to address those needs, but you just don't know, or you minimize them, because everybody will have interaction with a child or a teenager in their life at some point, but it's an individual case, it's not a collective. You just don't take it as serious.
You were talking about voting. Can you specify the age group? I think that will be really important.
For the podcast listeners, I do work with 15 to 19-year-olds a lot. I work with a bit older teenagers. The summer school that I run in Bulgaria is between 10 to 18. I tend to work with the 10 plus and I really with 13 plus. So this is when I talk about voting. I'm talking about people who, in the Gillick test are competent, who can make decisions by themselves and really do not require, in most cases, parental permission to make a decision because they're a fully formed person. When we talk about younger kids, we can then talk about manipulation, and that if you talk about voting, there will be differences there. But I'm not necessarily talking about going to the urn and actually casting a vote for a political party. I'm more talking about having a system where what the needs are being captured, apart from just regression analysis through large data sets from GCSEs or whatever, but more about proactive consideration of how we're creating our cities in the way that this generation at the moment is using. And my PhD research is in Spain, Bulgaria, and England. And actually, all the priorities of the young people that I've interviewed, again, 15, 19-year-olds, are pretty similar. It's always about safe city. It's always about green city. It's always about good education. It's always about quality of life at that point in life, whether they hang out, what opportunities to go and earn some money, what opportunities to socialize with their friends, easy transport, making sure that everything's environmentally sustainable. And if you actually compare the data, there's some real clear trends, given it's the European context, obviously there would be, but there's still three very different contexts. For me, it's interesting that at that age, people do tend to coalesce around similar values. I don't think that's necessarily the values that we kind of represent. I mean, a lot of people that I interviewed kept on saying, well, we're not doing anything about the homeless people in our cities. Both in Sofia and in Valencia and in Birmingham and in Manchester, empathy came up a lot. And then when you think about the way that we plan cities, we actually don't think about that, because that seems to be a value that we suppress as we grow older. And actually having that alternative voice is pretty important, because those are the teenagers going to school, encountering all these homeless people every day. So, it's just for them, that's a very live issue because they keep seeing it.
What needs to change, and how do you think is going to change?
I think we need a planning system, and that's not just with youth, but we need a planning system that respects communities more, and that it's not necessarily a technical question. I think that's a political question. But we also need to be much better as built environment professionals in communicating what those needs are. And I think this is why I went into the research route, because I was thinking, well, you kind of have to put that in a structured way for people to take you seriously first, and in a well-evidenced way. But we also need to rethink the values underneath the decision-making process that we make. I think a lot of the times at the moment, especially how policy is being made, the evidence base at some point starts skewing the underlying values, because you can't collect evidence on something that you haven't actually considered, or something that might be actually quite intangible, or something which should be just a pure moral value, which is we should value everybody everybody in society, not just all the people that earn money. We should value very old people that don't earn any more money, very young people that can't do that. But I think our value system is skewed. The bigger bit is ultimately instead that short term is you need to start giving good examples. And what I was saying, capturing all these different expertise of different people and systemizing them in a way that you can demonstrate them to policymakers, you can demonstrate to developers, you can demonstrate to people actually take investors and so on, that this is feasible, that this is actually workable, that this actually creates better communities because you involve everybody in the community, because it actually generates value for you, because you have happy young people on the streets and, don't have to kind of hide them away into back gardens and so on. I think the short term is actually demonstrating in a very easy, accessible way that this works, and there are ways to integrate that into the work that decision makers do.
Where are you in terms of your PhD research?
I picked the topic of smart cities because the type of policy that was becoming so influential with the built environment, but it wasn't actually sitting in planning departments. In a lot of places, if you actually look at the sort of smart city vision or the vision for the city, that's not necessarily a planning vision, that's it, or built environment vision. It's a vision in the economic directorate, there's a vision in the political leadership that owns it. A lot of council committees would have a kind of collective vision. Birmingham just published one, which is 2040 vision for Birmingham. That's kind of an economic vision, but then it's obviously feeding very much into place. And I think this is where my PhD comes into, is saying, okay, right, first of all, we're doing those visions. Are we connected them to the planning world and to the built environment world? If we are we listening to those who might not have any input in that vision? And are we adjusting then? Planning for me could be that filter which takes all these political visions, we want the future to look like this, and then actually really humanizes them in the local environment, because ultimately that's the bit that would have to deliver it. We would have to actually build those visions or readjust the built environment to accommodate those visions, whether it's a smart city or an eco city or whatever. But in that process, that's where planners and architects and built environment professionals could really come in, because they can be that connection with the community, with the young people, to really understand what the priorities are and adapt that vision, which is being top-down led. I think that's when come to the question of how. And I think a lot of the times planners I speak to are quite reluctant to engage with young people, not because they don't see the value, but because they don't know how. And also they don't really think about it. They don't even consider it. I worked on one project with a community in Birmingham where the planners, they just said, it's really hard to involve young people. And we went on the site, stood for 2 hours in the rain, and I spoke to 15 young people. But we actually went in to talk to the people. And I think it's something which all the financing issues that the system is experiencing at the moment is really cutting the ambition down. And we need to bring back, and we really need to say, no, it's not that difficult. You just go and talk. Children, young people are not aliens. They're just there and they're fully capable of conversation. I had a conversation with a 4-year-old on the plane, and it was a very informed conversation for a 4-year-old. But, I learned something about the way they were living, and I was thinking, okay, now I understand your perspective a little better. But it was a full conversation.
Do you think that we need better systems?
I think you're right. And I think also I would just point out that young people do require more upstart costs, I would say. You have to put a bit more support in the beginning because of that lack of expertise. And, maybe if you go and speak with, pensioners, or you go and speak with adults from a minority, maybe disability or whatever, you're still talking to adults who have experience of some of the structures of how maybe society works and how maybe business interactions work and so on. With young people, you wouldn't have that. So I think sometimes there is a bit of a learning process that needs to be embedded within that interaction. I think this is a prohibitive cost quite often, because on any project I've worked with and in the summer schools I run, and so I always have to chase young people because they haven't developed that responsibility yet about the work they're doing. But that's normal. That's why they're doing this at the moment. But you do have to put a bit extra support there. And I think quite often that puts people off. When you talk about infrastructures, there is a project which is really interesting at the moment in Finsbury Park in London called My Place. That's a youth-led planning investigation world where young people being trained to research and to understand what's going on in the community and come back and report to developers. And similarly, that's what I've been thinking a lot in my work. How do you create a process where in the process of consultation with all the communities, young people can play a key role? And I think that's really, really important because they are at the point of their life where they're really non-threatening. They're really, that people do talk to young people quite easily, so they can become that social glue very easily in a community, and they can get access to a lot of bits of the community that somebody coming from the outside or somebody who might have an agenda would struggle to, and would struggle to even have the conversations, like the first conversation. I mean, if you go as a developer in an existing community in a estate project, there is already a dynamic there which you can break even if you have the best intentions in the world. Same with councils. Sometimes people have such solidified opinions about their local council that it's really hard to break those down. Whereas with young people, that is not there. So you could really have an honest and frank conversation. They will smell out the bullshit as well. What I've noticed in some areas is this kind of drive to youth inclusion has started to mimic some of the early consultation debates where, it's not just box ticking, but also even it's manipulation, because they're being used just because they're young and they don't know, will convince them that everything is great. My experience is that they quite quickly smell out bullshit and they have access to a lot of information that maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago people wouldn't have. If you're going to be doing something controversial, they will research you and they will know what you're doing. And I get called out sometimes as well, which is fantastic. And they're like, oh, Simeon, we saw you publish this thing 3 years ago. Do you still agree with it? It's a good check. It's an easy way into a community, but it's not an easy way into a community to manipulate the community.
In my experience working with young people, it's very easy if I go through a school, but it's very difficult to work separate from a school for many reasons. What is your experience?
I think you're very right. You have to have an incentive. If you go to a gatekeeper, like a school or an organization. So the same school I run is with a foundation, so they have connections in schools, and that's how we recruit people. If I've worked in research projects where I've had to recruit my own collective of young people, you have to have an incentive. Money helps. If you pay young people to do some work for you, people would be interested. And I think that's all training or some kind of incentive works. I find that schools, especially in the UK and especially around the pandemic, are incredibly hard environment to even get anything in. I'm taught in quite a lot of schools through a program called the Brilliant Club in the West Midlands, where I've been teaching about my PhD. So it's been a bit of an inception. And it's something which is organized by an external organization, and the school actually pays to that organization to come and help and deliver some of it. Has been hard to get in with the school because they're just overworked. There's been a lot of behavior issues around the pandemic. I would say out of hours, extracurricular clubs, actually going on the street and setting a stall and going to the skate park, going to the park, going to after hours club or whatever, actually going to the places where the young people are, having a chat with a few of them and saying, what would you like to do? And I'm here again talking about teenagers because that's what, I do. With younger people, the system that we've set up, it just so that you kind of have to go through a gatekeeper. However, in the pandemic, a lot of my research happened on Instagram. And actually on Instagram is really, really easy and ethically problematic, I would say. But you can just get access to young people very easily because you can just DM them and say, we're doing this research project. Would you like to take part? That creates some other ethical issues and actually creates ethical issues the other way around because I have a separate Instagram account for my PhD project for which I've been doing recruitment. And I've had some young people message me some quite rude things. So then, so you kind of have to, that breaks a lot of barriers and that gatekeeping process that you're saying is not there, and actually 13 plus and even young on there, which is really ethically challenging, I think. Yeah, you just have to structure in a way where you put all these ethical barriers and policies and then really think, why are you actually contacting young people? I think if they're going to have some benefit for their own area or whatever, then yes, if there is something at the end of it, but if you're just going it blank, then it's going to be difficult.
Also because there's all these protection or safety issues, and as adults we feel really uncomfortable being around kids. You can't go to a park, playgrounds, let's say, and be around young people because parents or the adults will think that.
That's why you have to be very clear about what you're doing. You have, whenever I've done that, I've always university manuals and so on, and I've always been very forthcoming. Never obviously do anything that could be perceived in that way. I do think some of it is problematic to the point where it's a bit paranoid. And actually, Red Release has a really nice paper from 20 years ago, which talks exactly about this, about how that paranoia is actually really challenging for young people to be integrated in development processes because it just creates this us and others. So it's almost like you don't talk to them because somebody will think that you're there. I think this goes up to your own moral values as well, isn't it? And how well actually you are maintaining those boundaries. The easiest thing is to do it with someone else, to actually have proper oversight, to actually proper protocols. Yes, you have to clear everything with ethics. If you're part of an institution, if you're a council, for example, you would do that with another officer or whatever, and you follow protocol. But I personally don't think there is anything wrong with going to a place where people are hanging out and actually talking to them on the street in a public environment and just saying, what do you think about this area? Would you like to take part in this project? And so on, as long as obviously you followed everything ethically. I think that's a perception that is very damaging because then the young people are just there. They're just in the corner of the city and, nobody talks to them and they just only talk to themselves. And same, when I see people, I said I had a 4-year-old conversation on the plane. His mother was there. You can always just straight away check in, especially the younger children. The parent will be there or there will be some authority figure there. So you would straight away go to them and say, can I have a conversation because we're doing this and so on. Obviously, you have to clear everything up, but I don't think that should be a barrier for doing it. But it is a barrier when higher ups, especially universities, institutions are considered to give you the ethical. So you have to be very clear on the beginning. And this is another thing. You have to put a lot of work in the beginning. You actually have to create those support systems. You have to create that phone number that people can call you. You have to know, every time I've worked with young people, I always set up some money aside for like a mental health counselor, because you never know what might come up if it's a private project, or, have an understanding what are the support systems that if a young person suddenly starts reporting something to me, I can actually go and direct them in the correct area. So you have to put all of this effort in the beginning. And I think actually in that sense, it is prohibitive for a lot of people, but the structures are there. If you go to your social or youth work department in your council or in your area, they already have that. They have all the safeguarding policies. You don't have to reinvent anything. You can just actually ask them for help. The policies are there. You just have to follow them, listen.
Is there a question I should have asked you that I didn't ask you? And if so, what was that question?
Question I have on my mind at the moment is, where is the money coming from? Where is the money coming from for all this work? And where is the money going to come from for all this inclusion work that we all agree is going to happen and have to happen? It's not just with young people, with everybody else, but how are we actually going to challenge the economic structure that we've created for ourselves to be able to get that value redirected into that work that we want to do? And for me, that's just a personal question, because otherwise, with a lot of movements, and we spoke about it, it's 40 years, 50 years in the making, some of this, and it's just not happening. And I'm reading papers from 1805 who are saying exactly the same thing that we're saying today. And it's just not happened because the system that we have is just not channeling the value into that work. I think that's the question that I always keep asking, is like, how are you actually, and not just on a short-term basis, on a one procurement project where you set up a bit of money, but how are you actually going to change the structure of your organization to be channeling money into that work? We worked on one project with the Wellcome Trust on engaging young people in health and science research with two organizations called Beatrix and Shift, and I was working with Beatrix. The Wellcome Trust, in their funding processes, started changing some of the ways they actually fund projects to be able to recognize that need to involve young people. And that's a structural change in a funder. So you want structural changes in the way that money is being channeled in councils, in developers, in architects' work. Most of the architects I talk to have only ever spoken to a young person when they design a school. And you just think, yeah, but young people don't just use schools. Maybe 40% of their life, the rest is out there, and we just don't talk to them about it. Because in schools, you think, oh yeah, we should talk to young people because it's a school. Therefore, we'll set aside a bit of the budget and the time for somebody to go and do it. In another case, we're not doing a train station and thinking, oh, young people are one of the main people using trains. The moment they become independent, they start using public transport. But we're not talking about those issues with them.
But even with your parents, they use a train station or airports. The building money is just as theirs as ours. Funding to set up these systems in place and to be able to generate a life to them. Another reflective note that you want to leave with before you go.
I always say this to absolutely everybody clearly listening to this podcast. When this stops, go find a young person and just talk to them. Be on the train, on the street, one of your friend's child or something, like just have 20 minutes conversation with a young person and just ask them about all the work you do and what they think about it. Just have that conversation. I think a lot of people just don't have that conversation, and then that becomes this barrier that they don't even realize it's a barrier, but they just don't know how to talk to young people. And the key is they know very differently. Just talk to like you're going to talk to anybody else.
Thank you very much to my guest today, to all the listeners, and please subscribe to Architecture for Kids podcast and leave your rating and a review. Recommend us to your friends and family. And to find out more about it, visit our websites, antoniocaplan-portfolio.co.uk, buildingcentre.co.uk, thorntoneducationtrust.org, cardiff.ac.uk, and follow us on Instagram, Arch4Kids CIC, Twitter, @Kaplan, LinkedIn, @Kaplan, CAPELAO. And please join me again next week for another episode of Architecture for Kids podcast, brought to you in collaboration with the Built Environment Trust, the Thornton Education Trust, and the Welsh School of Architecture, Cardiff University.